Okay, so you all should get the pop-up now. So welcome everyone. As you know, this is a monthly webinar that was sponsored by the Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School, made possible because of a grant from the Bureau of Justice Administration. So we put on these webinars every month for folks who are involved in post-conviction litigation and investigations to give you information which is germane to the work that you're doing, and also information about how to learn from the work that you're doing, which is really what the focus of today will be. You've heard us talk about Sentinel event reviews before. It's a way of allowing a jurisdiction to conduct a non-blame focused review of what we often refer to as an unintended consequence or a bad outcome. It could be really anything in the criminal legal system, but exonerations in particular are a great way to really learn from error from a case. How did that particular error happen, and how can our system itself be improved to make sure that that particular error did not happen, won't happen again. So John Hallway, who I'll cede to in just a moment, is the executive director at the Quattrone Center. John, I will have to say, is the nation's leading expert on this, because as far as I know, he's the only one who has done Sentinel event reviews in multiple jurisdictions around the country around many different types of issues. So in addition to exonerations, John was called in Austin when the DNA lab kind of imploded to try to figure out what went wrong and how to improve the system. He's done a terrific report at the request of the Seattle Police Department on their response to the George Floyd protests and how they responded to that. He's done work around deaths in custody cases, and of course in exoneration cases. So John, I'm really very happy that you could join us about this, because I think it's important for folks to learn what is a Sentinel event review, how it can be used in jurisdictions to be able to learn from error and to be able to promote better ways of doing things throughout their jurisdictions. And I'll shut up now and let you take over.
I hate it when you shut up and turn it over to me, because I always would rather hear you talk than talk myself. But thanks to everybody for being on this call. I think this is really a group that I'm thrilled to present to. I really appreciate and admire the work that you all do and the way that you all go about it. So as Marissa said, I'm going to talk about Sentinel event reviews. I think that conviction integrity units are really logical places to initiate a lot of these reviews, because you see a lot of the errors in the criminal justice system as a result of the cases that you work on. And so I'm going to share my screen. I've got some slides to go along with this, and we will kind of see how it goes here. I would encourage all of you to ask questions as we go, and feel free to simply cut in and blurt in if you want, interrupt me, with audio, or you can send things into the chat as well.
And I will be monitoring the chat, folks. So if you have questions, you can either send it directly into the chat for everyone or just to me directly, and I will interrupt John when I like to get him to answer for us.
As you do. So can you see the slides? Are we good there? Okay.
Yes.
So both to have a little fun and to see, so this is what we'll cover. What are reviews? What are they? Why are they useful? How are they implemented? But let's start with playing a little interactive game just to get the juices flowing. So let me ask you all this question. I assume most of you got to work in a car if you are actually not at home, working from home today. We get in cars all the time. In fact, I was reminded during a rather harrowing Uber ride that often we'll get in cars with people we don't even know and count on them to get us safely to wherever it is we're going, knowing nothing about them. And the reason for that, not to give too much away, is that cars are generally pretty safe. But let's ask this question. For every 300,000 car trips, how many people do we think, how many injuries are there? We'll play Price is Right rules. So you want to go, as high as possible without going over. Then you win a toaster oven or something. You could put it in the chat if you wanted.
Yeah, put it in the chat.
Okay, 300, 100, 75,000. 3,000, 30%. Okay. So I think you guys have done a nice job of covering the waterfront on from 1 to 100,000. For every 300,000 car trips, 2 people are injured. So traveling by car, pretty safe. Good news for us because we do it quite a bit, although you wonder if that's cause or effect, right? Do we travel in cars because they're pretty safe, Or are things pretty safe because we do a lot of traveling in cars? I don't know. But 300,000 car trips, 2 people are injured. Let's raise the stakes a little bit, okay? Let's look at surgeries. You probably don't have surgery as often or as voluntarily as you do get in a car, and that's because surgeries are inherently more dangerous and more painful. Hospitals call things, the errors that happen in surgical arenas, never events. So a never event would be leaving a sponge inside of a patient's body, or operating on the right arm when you're supposed to operate on the left arm, or getting an infection in the hospital that you didn't have when you went into the hospital. These are errors in the healthcare system. We call those negative events. Same question, for every 300,000 surgeries, how many never events do we think there are? Nancy's sticking to 300 no matter what the scenario. 50,000, 25%, 3%, okay, 15 from Anna. Okay, so the actual answer is 25. So Anna, pretty close. Taylor nailed it. Maybe you're Googling as we talk. That's not allowed. That's cheating. So look, again, still pretty safe, right? I mean, there are errors. They happen. It's dangerous, but it is not as safe as getting in a car for sure. Okay, so now let's test your knowledge of the criminal justice system. For every 300,000 convictions, how many people are actually innocent? 33? 5%? 75? Taylor, if you're Googling, it won't help you. Destiny's sticking with 30%. Setting doesn't matter. I love it. Okay, so true answer is we don't know, right? You know we don't know. We can't prove the negative. We don't know how many people are in there where there's been a mistake in their cases. And then there's the whole school of thought that is, one is too many, which is something that of course I think we all agree, but also understand that perfection is not possible. What we do know, what we've seen from the number of exonerations in the capital punishment system is a rate of 4%. Can be reasonably predicted based on the existing data set of death row exonerees. So 4% seems to be a number that we could rely on, although the general body of criminal justice cases is certainly distinct from that body of capital punishment cases, right? Those have unique characteristics. But let's be conservative. Let's cut that 4% in half and say 2%. And if that's the case, then we're looking at 7,500 errors in the criminal justice system for every 300,000 cases. And so one of the questions that the Quattrone Center asked is, why is criminal justice so much worse at this than other industries that are, complex human interactions with dynamic information in stressful situations where people's lives are at stake, right? When I use that description to talk about a system, am I talking about criminal justice, transportation, or healthcare? Right? The answer, of course, is I'm talking about all three, and they share those things, right? In each of these situations, we've got teams of people working hard to get to a particular result, but it's high stakes, and it's stressful, and it's dynamic, and we have imperfect information, and we're doing the best that we can, and sometimes we just get to the wrong result. But in transportation and healthcare, we seem to have developed ways of behaving that have reduced our error rates much more intensively than we have in criminal justice. And so the Quattrone Center kind of existed to say, well, why is that the case? So one question is, well, when I talk about an error in criminal justice, what am I talking about? So certainly an inaccurate conviction, and I use that word to remove the kind of, moral opprobrium of wrongful from this, right? I mean, I think wrongful conviction is a term I hope we're all okay with, but let's just call them inaccurate convictions for right now. Getting it wrong on guilt or innocence is certainly an error. I would argue that a cold case from a system perspective is also an error, kind of the flip side, right? So wrongful conviction, we got the wrong person. Cold case, we didn't get the right person. We want to do both of those things. We want to hold people properly accountable for their actions, whether they did or didn't do the crime. I would argue that an officer-involved shooting or a death in custody is also an error if we define error as any outcome that we don't want our system to generate. right? If we want to design our system to provide public safety and to get the right guy in the right way and do something useful to reduce crime, right? Officer-involved shootings and deaths in custody are also errors that we ought to look at, because even if our officers have acted appropriately, and maybe especially if our officers have acted appropriately, these are just not outcomes we want in the system. And so we want to be constantly improving our system to avoid these sort of never events. So in the same way that operating on the wrong limb is a never event in healthcare, I would argue that these are never events in the criminal justice system, and they're deserving of some sort of review to see how we can continue to get better over time. And at the root of this, Sentinel event reviews for all of these systems are continuous quality improvement initiatives as opposed to blame and accountability initiatives. And that's a really important distinction that we'll talk about more as we go through. So let me pause here and see if anybody has any questions, if you're okay with the terminology we're using and you kind of get the metaphor. Obviously, there are some differences between criminal justice and healthcare and transportation. We have an adversarial system, et cetera, et cetera. But I would argue that the fact that we have adversarial roles doesn't mean we have a system that still doesn't want these right outcomes, right? We want accuracy in our outcomes. We don't want people to get hurt. We don't want people to die in our care. And I think the whole system can unify around those, which is why these are good moments for the system to come together and evaluate what's caused these things and how we can prevent them in the future. So, questions so far? Marissa, anything you'd like to elaborate?
Nope, doing good, although.
Okay. So the question we asked at the Quattrone Center was, if healthcare and transportation are better at this than criminal justice is, why is that the case? And so what will happen is, if you have a wrong side surgery, what will happen is what's called a morbidity and mortality review, or in lesser circumstances, a peer review, where the entire department will come together and the members of the team will present the case. They'll present the clinical situation to the entire department, and the department will assess objectively where people might have deviated from policy and protocol, where people might have had a discretionary choice that didn't go the way they wanted, where the system might have failed them in allowing for reduced communication or other problems, and how those contributing factors then led to the bad outcome. And then they'll work to strip out the contributing factors so that that error is avoided. So if any of you have ever been in the hospital, can you tell me what happens? You're sitting in the hospital, you're waiting in the emergency room, and you get 6 or 7 doctors and nurses who come through over about a 2-hour period to talk to you. What happens when each of them comes into the room? Anybody want to unmute and just tell me what that experience is like? Yeah, they ask you the same questions. Name and date of birth, right? I broke my wrist a few years ago, and it was like, John F. Hallway, December 24th, 1970. No, I don't smoke. Yes, I drink. More than you want me to, but less than if I had a problem. Right? And those are the conversations that you have. And you have that conversation with every single person who comes into the room. And why do you do that? Because 10 years ago, some other person came in and thought they were talking to John Hallway, but really they were talking to Anna Hamilton, right? And as a result, Anna got the care that was meant for John, and maybe that doesn't go so well for Anna, right? So every person is trained to come in and verify that, because this kind of process where they talk about the contributory factors has identified, well, the first thing we have to do is we have to make sure we know who we're dealing with, and we've proven it. And we have to keep in mind that they may have trouble communicating, so we got to get name and date of birth and figure out other comorbidities quickly and easily right when we come in. So that's an example of how this process might lead to contributory factors. What we haven't done in that situation is we haven't fired the nurse or the doctor who thought that Anna was John, right? What we've done is we've learned from that doctor or nurse who wanted to be helping John, but instead was confused about what was going on, and put them in a position where they're more likely to get to a successful outcome. Does that make sense? All right, so that's what we would do in healthcare. We do something similar in transportation, and in fact, transportation and aviation really started this, and healthcare kind of has co-opted it, and so now we're trying to do the same in criminal justice. So whenever there's a plane crash, or even a near miss in aviation parlance, which is when planes get too close to one another for comfort, the National Transportation Safety Board comes in, and they bring a bunch of interdisciplinary folks to do an investigation. And they do the same basic thing that we just described in healthcare. They identify the contributory factors. So they've got people there who handle weather conditions, communications, they the mechanicals, sleep patterns of the people who participated, whatever it might be. They gather all that information together and they look at all the contributing factors, and then they work backwards to try and get rid of those. So a similar process in transportation. Michelle, I see your question and I will get there in just a second. So here's an example, okay? About 10 years ago, Philadelphia, a train derailed, it left 30th Street Station on its way to New York, and it derailed in North Philadelphia. It took a turn at twice the suggested speed for a particular turn in the track, and it went off the rails and caused a lot of damage. Several people were killed, hundreds of people were injured, and this was the process that they went through. They brought in engineer experts, they brought in engine experts, they looked at all the signage, they looked at all the cell phone chatter, radio chatter. They learned, for example, that some kids in North Philadelphia had been reported by previous trains to be throwing slingshots at trains as they went by. If you're an engineer and you're going at 150 miles an hour and somebody throws a slingshot at your engine, it's actually no small thing. And they conducted this review and came out with a number of structural systemic changes to the Philadelphia to New York route, including adding some new technology that auto-stabilized the speed of the train so that the conductor was less required to do that, and so that it would kind of modulate. It's a little bit like cruise control for the trains in certain areas where, like this, where a curve might happen. So it's a way of, again, making sure that our people are put in positions where they're more likely to lead to success. Now, to Michelle's question, each of these situations, whether they're aviation or healthcare, have legislative safe harbors for event reviews that help them happen immediately after the event. Okay, so if it's this train derailment, the National Transportation Safety Board, their conclusions are public, but they're not admissible as evidence. So you can get their data and do your own analysis of it, but you're not allowed to use their conclusions as evidence. In healthcare, I think 48 of the 50 states have what's called a Peer Review Protection Act, which says that when you're doing these kind of safety reviews, the information that you're gathering is not discoverable. Criminal justice does not yet have that kind of safe harbor. And we've seen kind of two philosophies from people who want to conduct these event reviews in criminal justice. Philosophy one is you get a leader who will say, you know what, we're going to get sued anyway. This information is going to come out anyway, and we're going to do it, and we're going to be public about it. And the faster we do it, the better our community will trust us. And the lawsuit is going to go where it's going to go, but that's not actually my problem. My problem is, how do I make the system better, and how do I get the community to believe in the legitimacy of our process after we've found a mistake? The other way to go about it is to say, we're happy to do these event reviews, but we need any potential civil liability, civil litigation to be concluded. We need the settlement done before we'll do it. And we've worked in both those contexts. We've been successful generating useful reports in both those contexts. I think the closer to the event you are, the easier it is to get the information. As you get more information, the more contemporaneous it is. But we've had it work in both ways and been successful with it, and happy to discuss that in more detail if you want. So think about the difference in what we do in criminal justice, right? We don't, in criminal justice, we don't bring everybody together and look at this and say, how do we go forward? We do backwards-looking accountability with administrative hearings and reviews. We've got internal affairs, we've got, ethics boards, we've got whatever we might use to go backwards, and we've got civil liability, civil litigation, all of which looks backwards and says, who should pay, who should get fired, who should be punished, who should be criminally charged based on what happened in the past. We don't look forward and say, how can we learn from this and prevent what's going to happen in the future? And so what we would advocate for is not to get rid of those accountability mechanisms, and those are very important, but to add to it this concept of Sentinel event review, this concept of forward-looking accountability that each of our government agencies has, I think, as an obligation to their communities. right? The obligation isn't be perfect, though that's the goal. The obligation is continue to get better over time, and as we find situations that are problematic, learn from them and try to prevent them. So here's a graph of railroad-related fatalities from 1990 to 2015 using this event review process. And what you see is that railroad-related fatalities have gone down by more than 50% during that 15-year period. Here's another graph. This is officer-involved shootings from 2015 to 2021. You'll see that it's essentially a flat line. Okay, we're paying more attention to these shootings. I think they're getting more national news. I don't think that we have a situation where more officers or this, want to shoot people. Every time I've looked at an officer-involved shooting, the officer didn't wake up in the morning and think, this is great, I get to shoot somebody and lose my job or go on administrative leave, even if it's a justified use of force. What's happening is we're not putting our people in better positions to be successful at their jobs over time. We're not learning from them because we don't do these event reviews, and not surprisingly, we're not seeing the reduction in these events that we'd all like to see. And so we want to broaden the implementation of this process and make it part of a gradual sort of accepted cultural quality improvement initiative so that we get fewer of these incidents over time. So, how can we prevent future errors? As Benjamin Franklin just said, not just said, as Benjamin Franklin said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That satisfies my obligation as an employee of the University of Pennsylvania to bring Ben Franklin up in any public presentation. But that doesn't mean it isn't right? I mean, the quickest way to get rid of wrongful convictions would be to arrest the right person every time. That's not to say that police are responsible for every wrongful conviction, just to say when you go upstream and work at prevention, you have downstream quality improvement. And we're trying to help each part of the system act as either the preventer of an initial error or serve better in the check and balance role that in wrongful convictions the prosecutors, the defense, the judge, the jury should all be, so that we can avoid that situation where at the end of it we've got an inaccurate conviction. Okay. So we call these Sentinel event reviews, and the idea is a Sentinel event is an event like the Challenger exploding, or a plane crash, or a wrong side surgery, or in criminal justice, a wrongful conviction that is so obviously not the outcome that we want that it galvanizes people to come together and learn from it so that the entire system is made safer. So unintended or undesired outcomes that signify or signal underlying weaknesses in the system, almost always the result of multiple contributing factors, and provide ways to help us figure out where to make changes that are actually going to create the kind of safety that we want to see in the system. So a model for you to think about in how these happen in a wrongful conviction world, in the cases you're going to look at, is called the Swiss cheese model. Has anybody ever heard of the Swiss cheese model? Marissa has, but she's not. That's not. You don't count. Sorry, in this time. So the Swiss cheese model is a model of organizational safety and quality, is defined by a psychologist in the UK named James Reason, and he's got this great quote that I really like, which is, "We can't change the human condition, but we can change the conditions in which humans operate." So the idea is, look, if people don't want these outcomes to happen, right? Telling them to do something different is not going to change the outcome, because they're not acting in ways that they think it's going to happen, right? They're just trying to do their jobs the best way they can, and these things are happening anyway. Plus, in high stress situations, in imperfect information situations, people are going to make mistakes. That's the human condition. None of us is perfect, and no matter, let me ask this question. I don't know if I'm the only one who's like this. Have any of you gotten up in the morning, been kind of foggy, gone downstairs, put your cereal in a bowl, reached into the refrigerator, grabbed your carton, and poured orange juice on your cereal? Okay, now I don't do that often, but I have done that. And it's not because I don't know the difference between milk and orange juice, and it's not because I haven't been trained on what goes on my cereal, right? I've been perfectly well trained in that, but sometimes those mistakes are going to happen, and if I'm not paying close enough attention, and if the cartons are the same size, and whatever else, that might happen, right? So So we can't change the human condition, but we can change the conditions under which humans operate. We can make the orange juice a different shape than the milk, for example, so that when I grab something, I'm like, oh no, the milk is square and the orange juice has that new kind of pear shape with the round top on it. So now I know that's the orange juice. I shouldn't pour that on my cereal, right? So we're looking at those sorts of things, those sort of environmental changes. So back to the Swiss cheese model. The idea here is when you look at your wrongful conviction case and you want to figure out how to learn from it, think about that case as a block of Swiss cheese, and think about every single interaction or decision that was made about the case from the very beginning, the commission of the crime, until now, as slices of Swiss cheese. And the holes in the slices of Swiss cheese, those represent opportunities for error. Most of the time, what's going to happen is somewhere between that first slice and the end, we're going to catch that error, right? Another suspect is going to be identified. A sergeant is going to say, did you check this? A prosecutor, when they review the case for intake, is going to say, I'm not sure you've got enough here. The defense will come in and they'll say, well, no, my guy has an alibi. Whatever it might be, most of the time, we're going to catch that error somewhere between the identification of the suspect and a conviction. But every now and then, all of the holes in each of the slices of Swiss cheese line up. Every now and then, we get an error that starts at the beginning and all of our existing checks and balances fail to catch it. The prosecutors don't catch it. The defense either doesn't catch it or isn't able to change anybody's mind. The judge runs a courtroom in a way that doesn't pick it up, despite the rules of evidence and criminal procedure and all the things that are supposed to help there. A jury goes along with it, and now we've got that inaccurate conviction. Bad news, none of our existing checks and balances caught that. Good news for this process, we can have a conversation with every participant in that process and learn something that's going to help tighten up the holes in our Swiss cheese for each participant, for the police, for the prosecutor, for the defense, for the courts. And so in a sense, we've really kind of democratized quality improvement here. So it's not going to be a situation where any one agency is like, this was all your fault. It's going to be a conversation about how all of us can elevate our system to get more accurate results going forward, which of course is what everybody's trying to get. So the Swiss cheese model is this kind of model to show that it's never just one thing, right? It's both an error and then the failure of our existing checks and balances to act the way they were designed to catch this particular error. And what that means is that quality improvement is kind of a game of whack-a-mole, right? By definition, this happened despite what we wanted. So that mole pops up, surprisingly, and now we want to hit that down, and there will be another one. But with this process, we can get better and better at them over time and begin to reduce the frequency with which we see a new mole. So hopefully that makes sense. I used a lot of metaphors, and I'm probably mixing many of them, so bear with me. But other questions there? All right. Moving on. You can do this process anywhere we decide there's an error, right? So when the Quattrone Center goes to jurisdictions, and Marissa mentioned a couple of the places where we've done this, we go into the jurisdiction and we say, what's the error you, the community, would like to review? Let's agree on what the error is, and we'll apply this process to identifying the contributing factors and then coming up with communal consensual group recommendations for each participant's agency on where they can make changes that will address the contributing factors that we found in this case. So here's a list of areas where we've done this. I'll be talking about, sort of as a case study, 2 deaths in custody with the Tucson police. But as Marissa said, we've looked at errors in DNA labs. We've looked at situations where people were arrested and incarcerated inaccurately, but it didn't actually lead to a wrongful conviction. We've looked at situations where prosecutors made charging errors that caused them to have to actually withdraw charges because the charges were not accurate based on data that they learned about subsequently. Wrongful convictions, as I said, I think are a wonderful place to start because it's so clear that nobody wants them that it's easy to galvanize and get support for them. And these other contexts as well are places where we can do this. But really it comes down to any undesired outcome that you find that you wanted to act on is a great area to do these reviews in. So how do we do them? Well, the first thing we try to do, and I should say this, I'm going to give you John Hallway's utopian Sentinel event review, right? This is if we get it done exactly the way we want to do it, this is what it'll look like. Here's what else I'll tell you. It has never, ever, ever looked like this in real life, right? There's always somebody who doesn't want to participate, or some data that we can't get, or we can't talk to the officers involved, but we can get interview transcripts or something else. So it's never perfect, but it has never failed to generate some useful information. And as I've said to our groups, right, if we generate 45 recommendations for change and we could have generated 63, is that a failure? Right? I don't think so at all. I think it's about getting this process and this idea sort of inculcated in people's minds so that they don't see it as a threat, but instead see it as a responsibility and an opportunity to improve the system. And so we're happy to talk with you about the realistic hurdles that will exist in your jurisdiction if you want to do one of these. And in every one we've done, we've been able to, adapt to those in ways that preserve the utility of the process. And I'm confident we can do that in your jurisdictions as well. What is really important, especially in a wrongful conviction situation, so here in Philadelphia, the DA's office, the Defender Association, the police, and the Court of Common Pleas, and some recognized kind of criminal justice experts who are viewed as honest brokers by all of those groups, and I think you all probably have those people in your communities as well. We've now come together and looked at 3 inaccurate convictions and more to follow. And what we've learned in that process is that you really do need to have an objective moderator. We did a pilot project with NIJ on these. We had a moderator in ours. Who was the other jurisdiction? Milwaukee had a moderator in theirs, and Baltimore didn't have a moderator in theirs. And Milwaukee and Philadelphia managed to move forward. Baltimore totally broke down as the different agencies sort of pointed fingers at one another, and it was a challenge. And so having the independent moderator, especially when you've got multiple agencies involved, is a way to ensure that we're always reminding people of the underlying philosophies, that we're not in a blame context, but instead in a let's really honestly talk about how these things happen with good people trying to get to the right place, and kind of reinforcing that is useful. The idea is to have, as much as you can, the actual agencies that were involved. So, for example, in the one we'll talk about in Tucson, where we had deaths in custody, we had the police department, we also had the EMS and fire department, and we had the dispatch. All of those were separate agencies in Tucson. And we had each of those involved because they all had participated in being at the scene, dealing with the individuals, etc. And so we started from the event that we reviewed, the 2 events that we reviewed, started from a 911 call and proceeded to the undesired outcome. And we got each agency that was involved in that, along with some others. So this is an example of what you might have. You might have the city attorney involved if they were involved in habeas or anything like that. But for a wrongful conviction, that group in Philadelphia is pretty standard. So the defense, the prosecutor, the police, the court, and then if there are other subject matter experts who might come in. So for example, in one of these deaths in custody, we had a question about excited delirium. That was one of the things that had been pointed out as a contributing factor from the individual who passed away. And so we had a clinical psychiatrist and we had an emergency room specialist who had seen cases like this before to talk to us about the medical aspects of that we might not otherwise know. So we can, when we did the protests after George Floyd was murdered in Seattle and Madison, we brought in experts from other departments to talk to us about how those departments dealt with large protests and sort of First Amendment support, so that we could get some outside perspectives about that might be useful to the department there. So we can bring in subject matter experts relative to the particular issues that arise in the wrongful conviction, but you want to get all of those agencies participating, and what you'd like to have is people who are senior enough in those agencies that they can kind of recognize where challenges are, explain sort of what a reasonable participant would be expected to do in that situation, and then be thoughtful about when we come up with recommendations. The idea is the recommendation should be implementable. And so we want those people in the room to help us design the recommendations to make sure that we're not coming in from the outside and have a law of unintended negative consequences, right? We don't want to create more problems with a recommendation if it can't be implemented. And so as an example, here in Philadelphia, we had a conversation about a recommendation dealing with eyewitness identification, and it came down to the department, the DA's office and the police were like, well, we see why you want that, but here are the challenges we would have in implementing that. So we need to modify what you've suggested as a recommendation, and we could do it this way, right? Those are collaborative conversations to figure out where we want to make changes so that the agencies that we deal with have been part of that and therefore are willing to implement the recommendations when they're done. Does that make sense? So this is who you have around the table. It's going to vary case by case, but in a wrongful conviction, I think the parties you can have a core that can be here and do this. And then this is the process we go through. Now, in a wrongful conviction, there's often quite a lengthy record. And so what we'll try to do is, the first thing we'll do is we'll create the core team, and then we'll ask each participating agency to provide to the moderator all of the documents that they have. And in Philadelphia, we've created a process of confidentiality where no group was comfortable sharing their documents with each other, but they shared them with the Quattrone Center under a disclosure agreement. We keep those confidential, and what we do is we synthesize that information and we come back and provide a kind of chronology of the event, right? So based on all the documents we have, this is, who, what, when, this is how this happened. We de-identify the descriptions. So we're not using anybody's name in this. We talk about the roles. So we might talk about Officer 1 or the sergeant or, the ADA number 3, but we're not going to use, Marissa's name, right? Because this is not a blame exercise. This is a how do we help these people in their roles get better. And so even from our first draft, we're going to gather that information, but we're not going to use proper nouns in the conversation. So we provide this timeline to the group, and along there we would say, okay, based on what we've seen, here's a straw man, here's an initial shot at what we think are the various factors that contributed to this. So, we think that, so we just looked at one, at a case where a man was exonerated, and a forensic test that ultimately led to his exoneration. The test had been conducted on the last day of his trial. Nobody seemed to know this in the courtroom at the time. It wasn't actually, a report wasn't actually generated. It wasn't actually disclosed until 14 years later, and then it was sort of only disclosed because the DA's office had lost their file, and so they took the forensic file and sent it over, right? There's all sorts of communication and structural issues involved in that we could point to as potential contributing factors. And so that's just sort of an example of what we might do. We might look at that situation and say, okay, so what we see as contributing factors are boom, 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 boom. We'll list those out. We sit down as a group and we analyze that. We talk about, do we think A is a contributing factor? Well, maybe, maybe not. B, yeah, I think B is. You know what you all are missing? You're missing F, right? That's another contributing factor that I see here. The group agrees on that. And then once we've got agreed on contributing factors, we come back together again. And we say, okay, what would we want to change to prevent contributing factor 1, right? What would we want to do to prevent contributing factor 2? And we draft that up. And again, if we don't agree, if we don't have a consensus on either a contributing factor or a recommendation, we don't use it, okay? Sometimes we've done kind of minority reports. We've done a situation where we said the majority of the group likes X. Some people in the group worry about that. And so as an example, in Madison, when we did their protests after George Floyd, a big thing that the group knew the city and the community was going to want to talk about was, is the report going to recommend the ban of tear gas? And ultimately, the group did not reach agreement on that. And so we put a footnote in the report that said, we understand the community is concerned about this. These are the positions that members of the panel, again, not identified, but that members of the panel, the review panel took, and the concerns about the use or inability to use tear gas. And so these were the arguments, and we didn't reach a consensus on that. right? So that's a perfectly acceptable outcome as well, because again, this is about how we as a team come together to make recommendations for improvement to the system. And if there are areas of disagreement, it's perfectly legitimate, I think, to identify those and have those continue and be ongoing conversations. So once we agree on the reforms and recommendations, we publish a report. The agencies that are there have agreed to implement the recommendations, and hopefully we'll circle back. What both Tucson and Madison have done, and Seattle is going to do this as well, is they published a year later a list of this is what here's recommendation 1. This is the status of our implementation of it. Recommendation 1 done. Recommendation 2 in process. Recommendation 3 not in process. Can't do. Here's why. Right, and that kind of transparency as to what they implemented was, I think, a really important thing for the community to see the value in these reports. So this is the general process, and the hope is that then this process is ready for the next wrongful conviction, the next exoneration that your office identifies, or whatever other errors you might want to go and look at.
So, John, there's a question from Adele in the chat, which is about at whose bequest are these reviews conducted? Like, who's asking for it to be done?
So in Philly, the original one, we actually got some funding from NIJ to do the first one, and we went around to our jurisdiction and said, hey, we've got this funding, would you all be willing to do this? And that's how we did the first one. And from time to time, I'll see an event and I'll reach out to people in that jurisdiction and I'll say, hey, we're the Quattrone Center and we're here to help, and we'll do them that way. But as we've done more of them, so Tucson reached out to us, Madison reached out to us, Seattle reached out to us and said, we think this might be a way to engage more productively with community, more transparently and in a structured way, and we want to shift the dialogue away from blame and accountability and get it back to how we as a department can more effectively provide the kind of safety and quality that we want to provide. So it's happened both ways, but certainly it started with us proselytizing, and I think increasingly it's folks coming to us, and we're happy to do either one. Who specifically is they? So it was the police department in Tucson, it was the police department in Madison, it was the Office of Inspector General in Seattle. So an agency that had participated in some way in the bad outcome is always the generator. And I think what we have seen is that district attorney's offices, because in most jurisdictions you are the chief law enforcement office, right? The DA or the state's attorney or county attorney is the chief law enforcement official, has, I think, a certain amount of moral weight. And when the DA's office says this is something we think is a good idea, we'd like to try this, it's easier for other organizations to go along with it, right? That's a really important thing to happen. And so another reason why we're thrilled to be presenting this to this group today is that fact. I can't imagine the police asking this here in years ago. It would be great to hear the DA can't get the police to the table. Well, yeah, and I think honestly, we built this group in Philadelphia at a time when I think the agency heads can change, and that can complicate things for sure. And there does need to be some trust among the participants. We work hard at, we've got some techniques as we bring the groups together to help the individual participants get to know each other. And in Tucson, in Madison, in Seattle, we had a number of community participants, so people who weren't from these agencies but just were community representatives. And we spent a fair amount of time making sure that there were some rules of engagement that everybody felt comfortable with, where everybody could feel comfortable speaking their mind, and we created an atmosphere where that could be done, I think, honestly and safely, right, for all involved. Because one of the things that you learn pretty quickly is, it is traumatic for the community for these things to happen, but it is traumatic for the participants in it as well. It is very, very psychologically upsetting to a prosecutor to be part of a wrongful conviction. It's very, very upsetting to an officer to be part of an officer-involved shooting or a death in custody. The professionals that we work with in these roles, they don't want to be part of these events any more than anybody else does. And it's really important that we understand kind of the emotions that everybody's bringing with them into this process. And we spend a lot of time making sure that we have open lines of communication. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the Tucson context. So let me actually move to that because I think it'll help with what we're talking about. So if you'll forgive me for a sports metaphor here, I haven't come up with a better one to describe kind of what we try to do when we're gathering information. So again, ideally we would be able to talk to the actual participants. That's not always the case, and so we make do. But when we're able to, the people that we interview about their roles in these things, what's important is that we gather information about what they were thinking about in the moments they were involved in the case, right? What was their then current knowledge, right? And so think about, I've used Jalen Hurts because I'm from Philly and football season has just started, but think about a quarterback, an NFL quarterback throwing an interception, okay? So whatever you might think about Jalen Hurts, and if you're not from Philadelphia, I'm sure you've got your opinions. Whatever you might think about any NFL quarterback, right? They're one of the 30 best people in the world at what they do. They're incredibly talented individuals. They've been rigorously trained. They've run the play that they're about to run a cajillion times. They know exactly what's supposed to happen. And then the whistle blows and the ball is hiked and 22 people start doing all sorts of crazy stuff. And it all breaks loose. And somebody falls down and somebody else has got a defensive coverage that we didn't expect and the crowd is cheering and maybe it's raining. And while all that's happening, Jalen Hurts is processing and moving around and making decisions. And then he throws a ball that he thinks is going to get his best outcome, and it doesn't. It leads to an undesired outcome, in this case, an interception. Now, me and my buddies, we're on the third deck. We've had a couple of beers, and we're screaming, fire the bum, okay? And maybe he should get benched. Maybe he did something wrong. But when Jalen Hurts sits down with his quarterback coach, what the quarterback coach says is, let's look at this frame by frame, and you tell me what you saw. Right? You tell me what you saw and why you did the things you did, and then I'm going to work to restructure this play in a way that gets us both into the end zone, which is where we want to go. Okay? That's what we're trying to do with our interviews. We're trying to understand why these actors thought that what they did was what was in their best interest to get to the outcome of an accurate arrest, conviction, what have you, right? And that's a very different way of asking questions than we're asking questions if what we're trying to do is either impose or avoid liability for something. And as a result, we're asking those different questions, we're getting different answers. And that those answers take us sometimes in some pretty surprising places and help us make different recommendations for change. So with that as background, let me talk about Tucson. So we were brought into Tucson about 3 months after George Floyd was murdered. Tucson had 2 deaths in custody in the spring of 2020. One was almost completely by the book. Hit and run, guy gets out of his car, runs into an alley, officer follows him, has reason to believe that he's armed. The civilians are also in the alleyway. A civilian and an officer and the guy get into a fight. It ultimately takes 6 officers 4 minutes to get the guy subdued and in handcuffs. They get him subdued. They follow all the protocols for sitting him up and minimizing the problems on his heart. They call for paramedics. The paramedics come. They administer to him. They take his vitals. The guy's fine. He says he's fine. They pack up, and when they're 30 seconds away from him, he codes and dies in the ambulance. So that's death in custody number 1. Death in custody number 2, the officers deviate from the playbook almost completely. They get a call from an elderly grandmother who doesn't speak English as a native language. She says that her son is threatening her and is using drugs, and she's scared. They get to the house. He's naked in the garage. They come in like a ton of bricks, throw him down, and basically a George Floyd scenario ensues, and right down to I can't breathe, and he dies in the garage. Tucson brought us in about 2 months after this. There was a third issue, which was that in the second death in custody, they had violated their own protocols and hadn't disclosed the video the way they said that they would to the community. And so we looked at all 3 of those issues, the 2 deaths in custody, they disclosed the video, and those were our 3 Sentinel events for review. And we came in with a group that involved, as I said, the police department, EMS and fire, dispatch, a number of community individuals, and somebody from city council and somebody from the police union wanted to be part of this as well. And so that was our group. We looked at all of the events, and we created, this is what's called a fishbone diagram. This is actually created by Toyota as a way to improve safety in manufacturing, and using some of these same principles that we've talked about. And you can kind of see here how what you've got is, areas where we thought there were procedural problems that the officers were following, problems with communication, problems where supervision or leadership had contributed to bad outcomes, the environment in which they were making decisions, equipment that they did or didn't have. There was a shooting in Philadelphia with a guy with behavioral health issues where the officers dispatched didn't have tasers. And so when the guy came at them with a knife, they used deadly force, they used their guns, and the guy died. Well, why didn't he have tasers? We didn't have tasers because the purchasing process that Philadelphia had to use through the city of Philadelphia had only gotten tasers for a third of the department, and these officers weren't in that third, and so they didn't have a less lethal option when somebody came at them under these circumstances. So did the officers act appropriately? Well, we could get into that, but what we know is that we have a purchasing problem that didn't get them where they wanted to be and didn't give them the equipment they could have had. Am I flickering on everybody's screen or just mine?
Yeah, you're flickering a lot there, bud.
You're flickering.
Okay, let's see if I can fix that. Hold on.
There you go.
Okay.
That's fine.
Let me change that. Okay. So, with that list of contributing factors, we came up with 32 contributing factors. That actually led us to 53 recommendations for change. So the recommendations for change might have been changing certain things for the police, certain things for EMS, and certain things for dispatch for one specific contributing factor, right? You might say, well, we want to make changes in different places for this contributing factor. But again, it wasn't any one thing, and it wasn't any one department where we asked for changes to be made, and these were consensual things with the group. Now, what we had in our group, as I said, we had some community members, and I think this is so the types of reforms that we come up with, again, are different, right? So often what we come up with, training is generally a necessary but not sufficient recommendation for change. And the reason is that the same problem that Jalen Hurts has in my quarterback example, right? Which is training is good, and then you get into a situation where things are happening really fast and you have to make decisions. And sometimes our training hasn't prepared us for the decisions. And sometimes, we see things differently and we act based on them. So equipment is one, communication is one, changing the environment is one, and there's, recommendations kind of come in all of these. But similar to so another one of my environment examples. So I talked about pouring orange juice on your milk. This is an example of a diesel fuel pump. Has anybody ever gone to the gas station with a car that's not diesel and pulled up in front of the diesel pump and just tried to begin pumping gas because you weren't really paying attention? So what happens when you do that? Yeah, Nancy's like, yeah, almost did, and it's bad. It would be bad. It would ruin your car. And so what they've actually done is they've made these, it doesn't fit, right? The diesel pump is made to be a larger gauge that won't fit into a regular gas tank. And the reason is because if you're not paying attention, you could grab it and put diesel in your car, and then your car would collapse, and that would be bad. So we've changed the environment by simply changing the shape of these diesel pumps. And that, again, prevents us from doing things that would hurt ourselves, not because we don't know how to pump gas, and not because we don't know that diesel is bad, but because sometimes that happens anyway. So it's that sort of thing of protecting our people from themselves, setting them up to make the right decisions more easily, and those sorts of things I think are important. This is one reason, for example, why tasers again are a different shape than guns, and why tasers always go on one side of our hip and not the other is to make sure that we're doing everything we can to help our officers make these good decisions. In a wrongful conviction realm, we have different examples, but the same sort of approach. I think one of the things that makes this important is when we involve community members, we're really using procedural justice and restorative justice concepts in how we actually do the reviews. So it's really helpful to our participants to hear how community perceives of some of these events. Because in the Tucson example, for example, when we looked at the video, of the first death in custody where the officers did everything by the book. And what became very clear was the government participants and the community participants looked at the same video and had drastically different perceptions of the events. And so it was important to the department to understand those different perceptions so that they could craft recommendations that would be responsive to a community that was skeptical about the truthfulness of the exercise. Okay? And so, as an example, what happens in Tucson is after there's been this kind of fight between an officer or a group of officers and an individual, a community member, a whole second squad comes in and replaces the first squad that was there and tends to the individual victim. So in this case, we had the 6 officers that were in this fight with the Latino man, and those officers, a new squad comes in, and those officers are taken away. And we're watching the video, and we're seeing tons of officers in the alley, and there's a group of officers talking to the officers who were involved in the fight. And then there's another group of officers that are standing by and looking after the individual who's now in restraints. And the community says, and the officers that are talking have been in the fight, they're almost kind of chuckling and laughing. And what the other police officers see is a group of officers consoling these officers who've been in a fight, whose adrenaline is running, and who've had this experience. And what the community members saw was a complete lack of regard for Latino life. And so trying to have a conversation where we understand those perspectives and can explain to the community the reasons behind a particular policy so that the conversation is, should we change this policy based on your perceptions of it? And if so, why or why not? And reach a consensus view is a way of giving the community access to voice in and a feeling that they've been heard in this process so that they then go into the community and are actually proselytizing or advocating for the process. And so here we have quotes from Chad Kazmar, who now is the chief in Tucson, then was the assistant chief, who was the most senior officer in this review, and Tanya Strozier, who is a community member, a middle school principal, who participated in our review without really any kind of background in this sort of thing, but just as an interested community representative. And we came out of it with these recommendations for change and things. And Tanya said, this process really humanized the police for me. I didn't realize that the reason these officers were removed from the situation and a whole new group came on was because we didn't think these officers could actually be calm enough to administer care to the young man who was in restraints. Now I understand that better, and I'll explain that to my community, but I also believe that the police are thinking about safety more than I thought they were. And on Chad's perspective, he was like, look, I have to understand how I'm being perceived if I want what I'm doing to be perceived as just, right? And so when you can get the process working in this way, you really do not only get better quality outcomes, but you actually begin to heal the distrust that the community has whenever one of these errors happens, right? Because every time we have an exoneration, people are like, why does this keep happening? And now with these event reviews, we can provide a different answer to that question. And we can provide some evidence and get some people involved to say, this is what we've learned from this. This is why we think this will happen less and less in the future. So that's what I've got for today. My contact information is here, and Marissa will be able to share the slides. But I think we do have a little bit more time, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. And so over to you, Marissa and team.
Right. So thank you, John. And I know we have, I see Lauren Lipscomb kind of hanging around and some other folks who've been part of Sentinel event reviews that you've done. I want to kind of welcome them in to share their experiences in this process. I think one of the things that folks are particularly interested in is the outcome of that. So what impact, John, does the review have on the jurisdiction? Once you come out with these recommendations, then what?
So, and I'd love to hear Lauren's thoughts on that as somebody who has, implemented some of those things. But again, when we did a wrongful conviction in Baltimore, and around the table we had the police department, the defense, Michelle Nethercott, who I know is on the phone from the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project. Lauren was there, the first assistant in the office was there. And the idea was for each of those folks to be able to say, okay, based on this is what I think would improve our office's ability to perform the way we want to in these situations. And because the office has been involved in the definition of and creation of the recommendations, the hypothesis is that it's more likely that they will actually be implemented. It is then on the office to implement them. The Quattrone Center has, no, we have no authority really throughout the process. It's a voluntary process from start to finish. But I would turn it over to Lauren or others to talk about what they did to then implement those.
Hi, everybody. Lauren Lipscomb, Baltimore City, Chief of the Conviction Integrity Unit. Good to see many of you again. Yes, we underwent the Sentinel review process with John and his team back in, oh my gosh, about 5 years ago now. And what we were able to gain was really the recommendations informed how we proceeded with certain policies here in the office. And so, yes, here in Baltimore, we took, and off the top of my head, and I apologize, I was caught off guard. I wasn't prepared today to speak. Thank you, John. But we did, in fact, use a lot of the information that was gathered during that review process and that report that was disseminated. We used a lot of that information to inform policies here in our office in terms of how we gather documents, how we prepare discovery. There were a couple of things that, and again, I just off the top of my head, I just can't remember exactly what those things were, but that's what we did. So we used it as a tool to inform internal policies because, as John mentioned, we certainly aren't. It's not a controlling document. We're not mandated to follow any of the recommendations, but certainly, as with any sort of after action report type exercise, we were able to gather some good information that helped inform how we could better go through our discovery process, our pretrial process in preparing our cases.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we certainly had conversations, Lauren, that I know you'll remember where, there might have been moments where, Michelle might have said, well, what if the prosecutor did it this way? And, Jan would say, well, here's the risk with that. This is what I would worry about if we did it that way, right? So it's a group consensual process to get there, right? It's not just, and a number of people have said, oh, wait till we get the Quattrone report. And I always say, this isn't a Quattrone report, right? This is a Baltimore event review team report, and the participants are generating what the contributing factors are, and we're moderating that process, right? And so I think the recommendations, again, get kicked back and forth among the participants to get to a place where people feel like, okay, this is something I can do that will make things better and not have unintended consequences, right?
Absolutely, and not only with just our agency, but also I remember that BPD, we all were given, it was really a collaborative process. Yes.
Great. I'm sorry to put you on. No, I'm not sorry to put you on the spot, but I did put you on the spot like unexpectedly. But I will say that one of the things that has always kind of impressed me of talking to folks, John, that you've worked with is their willingness to go through it again and their belief in the process. And do you have folks coming to you or coming to the Quattrone Center on like a repeat basis saying we want to do this ourselves? Can you kind of help us navigate that?
We do, and I think the Philadelphia Event Review Team is a great example where we've done we're on our fourth case that we've reviewed, and we're going to publish that report I think sometime in the fall. We're meeting actually tomorrow to do kind of a final spin through on the recommendations, and we're working with the Conviction Integrity Unit, and they have a new kind of compliance office position that they've put in, and we're working with those two folks to select the next case for the group to review. So that's becoming a repeatable thing. One of the challenges with this work sometimes is if you, depending on what you call an error, in any one jurisdiction. Hopefully it's not happening very often, right? Hopefully Sentinel events in your jurisdiction are not everyday occurrences, and so it's not like every day we've got a new thing to review. But Seattle is working on how they're going to implement it more broadly. Tucson has an event that they're looking at right now that we expect to work with them on. And so that is happening. That kind of cycle of improvement is happening. And I see there's a question in the chat, and the question is the overall average time it takes to complete. So this is really kind of case dependent. And the reason for that is it sort of depends on how much data there is to crunch. So when we did the Tucson event reviews, we looked at two basically 15-minute incidents, right? From 911 to the death in custody. Each of those was about 15 minutes, and we were able to do each of those reviews and get that report generated in a couple of months. There's a wrongful conviction that we're looking at now where the original events occurred in 1986, and we've got an incredible appellate record, and it took us, I would say, 8 or 9 months to gather the data we want, try to interview people, and synthesize it in a way that was useful. And then there were enough different things to talk about that we probably had, 10 bi-weekly meetings where we went through all of that stuff. So it can vary based on the size of the case. With Madison, we were looking at 90 days of protest video. It was a tremendous amount of material to crunch, and that took a little while too. But so that's sort of a range of things. And Lauren, I don't remember how long ours took, but it was 6 or 7 meetings that we had. And what generally happens is we gather all the data, that takes some time. We crunch the data, that takes some time. But the process is really designed to maximize the use of your time. So we try to do the background work and circulate it so everybody comes prepared to discuss the things, and we only convene the group of participants, to understand the ground rules, agree on the philosophy, figure out how we're going to get the data, figure out who we're going to be able to interview and navigate that, and then it's let's go through the chronology, identify the contributing factors, and then it's let's do the recommendations. And then you get a draft of the report, and we bang that out. So it's much more seamless from the participant perspective, and the Quattrone Center will do all of that collaborative sort of coordinator work. Nancy asks if there's any pushback on the concept. Yeah, there's a ton of pushback on the concept, right? There are people who don't want to hear it. There are people who don't want to invest in it. There are people who think it's just going to empower rapacious plaintiffs' counsel. There's all sorts of reasons that people throw up there as to why they might not want to do this. But such is the case with a lot of new things. And if you look at the way it's worked in these other industries, and you look at the results we've gotten to date, nobody who has done this event review has walked away from it saying, I didn't learn anything, or I thought it was a waste of time. Just really simple. We're asking different questions. And so we're learning different things and surprising things about where we might be able to make change, other than, because, again, look at that thing on officer-involved shooting. Like, raise your hand if you think if we fire all these officers, there are going to be fewer officer-involved shootings, right? Like, this is more than a bad apple problem, right? There may be some bad apples, but wrongful convictions, it's bigger than that. And you all know that from where you sit and the cases you look at. And so firing people and punishing people is not our path out of this. So there has to be something else to do. And we think this is one way to get there. And what we also think is that we are going to be able to hopefully provide some funding to do this. So to make it that much easier for you, because that's another objection, is people worried about how much it's going to cost. And so I think we're going to be able to work with you if you have a case to try and do that in a way that that minimizes the potential cost to you, and hopefully minimizes it down to zero. But we'll have to see about that. I can't quite promise that yet, but I'm hoping that I'll be able to promise that in the near future. So don't let cost be a barrier in reaching out if you have a case that you think might be useful for this, and then we'll work that out with you.
Just looking to see if there are any other questions. And John, I'll just ask you to hang out just a couple minutes after we end, in case folks do have something they want to follow up with you individually. Thank you. And just a reminder for folks, we do these meetings every month. Next month we will be having 2 presenters on ballistics and ballistic reviews. One is an actual practitioner who does the reviews, and the other is the Honorable Paul Grimm, former judge from the Eastern District of Maryland, I think. Looking at you, Lauren, if that's correct. She's nodding and giving me a thumbs up, so I got that right. So Judge Grimm has been involved in several of these cases, pretrial motions, and his rulings have been pretty influential throughout the bar. So he's agreed to join us. Not quite sure why, but he will be joining us. So that's one for folks to look on. And of course, as we always say, if there are other topics you would like to have us cover, please let us know. But we appreciate everybody's time. Thank you for joining us.
Ariel, I see your hands up.